The storm came out of nowhere. It wasn't the kind of storm you could predict with satellites and weather models. It was the kind that felt alive, as if the sky itself had woken up angry. Lightning split the heavens in jagged streaks, illuminating the Icelandic countryside in bursts of eerie light. The wind howled like a wolf, tearing at the grass and sending loose rocks tumbling down the hillsides. And then there was the rain, cold, relentless, and sharp as needles. Dr. Elin Sigurdsson pulled her hood tighter around her face, shielding her eyes from the downpour. Her boots squelched in the mud as she trudged up the hill, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She had been waiting for this moment for years. Decades even. The runestone she had discovered earlier that day was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its carvings were ancient, older than any known Norse artifact, and they seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow. Elin had spent her entire career chasing myths. As a child, her father would tell her stories of the gods, Odin, Thor, Loki, and the great battle of Ragnarok that would end the world. But as she grew older, those stories became a source of ridicule. Her colleagues dismissed her as a fringe theorist, a woman obsessed with fairy tales. Even her father's disappearance during an expedition to uncover the truth about Ragnarok was written off as a tragic accident. But Elin knew better. The runestone was proof. Its carvings depicted a prophecy. Ragnarok was not a past event, but a future one. The signs were all there: unseasonal storms, volcanic eruptions, sightings of creatures that shouldn't exist. The world was changing, and no one was paying attention. Elin, the voice cut through the storm, sharp and urgent. Elin turned to see Magnus jogging up the hill, his expensive hiking gear already soaked through. Magnus was a tech billionaire with a penchant for the eccentric. He had funded her research for years, though he always treated it as a hobby, a way to pass the time between board meetings. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "This storm, it's not natural." Elin ignored him, her focus entirely on the runestone. She knelt in the mud, brushing away the dirt and moss that clung to its surface. The carvings were intricate, a mix of runes and symbols she had never seen before. But one thing was clear: this was a warning. "We need to get out of here," Magnus insisted, his voice rising over the wind. "This isn't safe." "Safe?" Elin snapped, her eyes blazing. "Do you think the gods care about safe?" "This is bigger than us, Magnus. Bigger than anything we've ever known." Magnus hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. He had always humored her theories, but now, standing in the middle of a storm that defied explanation, he wasn't so sure. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Elin traced the carvings with her fingers, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's a prophecy. Ragnarok is coming, and if we don't act soon, it will be the end of everything." The storm lasted for 3 days. When it finally subsided, the world felt different. The air was heavier, the sky a deeper shade of gray. Reports began to flood in from around the globe, unexplained phenomena that defied logic. A volcano in Iceland erupted without warning, its ash cloud blotting out the sun. In Norway, a fisherman claimed to have seen a serpent so large it could wrap itself around the world. And in New York City, a man swore he had seen a figure with one eye and a spear walking through Times Square. Elin and Magnus watched the news in silence, the weight of the runestone's prophecy hanging over them like a shadow. "We need to find the others," Elin said finally, breaking the silence. "Others?" Magnus asked, raising an eyebrow. "The ones who can help us decipher this," she replied, gesturing to the runestone. "A linguist, a historian, someone who understands survival." "We can't do this alone." Magnus nodded, though his skepticism was still evident. "And what if we're wrong? What if this is just, I don't know, a coincidence?" Elin turned to him, her eyes hard. "You felt it, didn't you? Out there in the storm." "Something's coming, Magnus. And if we don't figure out how to stop it, no one will." The team came together quickly, though not without resistance. Dr. Ingrid Larson, a linguist specializing in ancient languages, was the first to join. She had spent her career studying runes and was immediately intrigued by the runestone's carvings. Next came Eric Johansson, a historian with a deep knowledge of Norse mythology. He was skeptical at first, but changed his mind when he saw the runestone for himself. Finally, there was Freya Olsen, a survivalist and former soldier who had spent years living off the grid. She didn't believe in gods or prophecies, but she knew how to survive in a world gone mad. Together, they began to piece together the runestone's message. It spoke of a bridge between worlds, a way to reach the gods before it was too late. But it also warned of a price, a sacrifice that would have to be made. As the team worked, the world outside grew darker. The storms returned stronger than before. Volcanoes erupted in places that had been dormant for centuries. And then there were the creatures. Wolves the size of cars, birds with feathers made of fire, and shadows that moved on their own. The first sign of Ragnarok had come. And the world was not ready. The final piece of the puzzle came in the dead of night. Elin had been poring over the runestone for hours, her eyes straining in the dim light. Suddenly she saw it, a symbol she had missed before. It was small, almost hidden among the other carvings, but it was unmistakable. "The Bifrost," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What about it?" Magnus asked, leaning over her shoulder. "It's not just a myth," Elin replied, her heart racing. "It's real. And it's here." The team gathered around the runestone, their faces illuminated by its faint glow. The Bifrost, the mythical bridge between worlds, was the key to stopping Ragnarok. But finding it was only the beginning. As they prepared to leave, Elin couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows, its single eye gleaming in the moonlight. But when she looked again, it was gone. The storm had passed, but the calm was fleeting. The world was on the brink of something unimaginable, and Elin and her team were the only ones who could stop it. But as they set out on their journey, one question lingered in the back of her mind. What would they have to sacrifice to save the world? The world was unraveling, and no one seemed to notice. At least, not at first. The storms that had begun in Iceland spread like a plague, sweeping across continents with unnatural speed. In Japan, a typhoon with winds strong enough to flatten skyscrapers tore through Tokyo, leaving behind a trail of destruction. In Brazil, the Amazon rainforest burned with flames that refused to be extinguished, their smoke blotting out the sun. And in the Arctic, the ice caps cracked and groaned, as if the earth itself were crying out in pain. Elin and her team watched it all unfold from the safety of Magnus's private research facility, a sprawling compound hidden deep in the mountains. The facility was a fortress of technology, equipped with everything they needed to decode the runestone and prepare for what was coming. But even here, the signs of Ragnarok were impossible to ignore. "It's happening faster than we thought," Elin said, her voice tight with worry. She stood in front of a large screen displaying a map of the world, its surface dotted with red markers indicating disaster zones. "We're running out of time," Magnus agreed, his usual confidence replaced by a grim determination. He had thrown himself into the mission with a fervor that surprised even Elin, his skepticism replaced by a growing belief in the prophecy. The team had spent the past week deciphering the runestone, their progress slow but steady. Dr. Ingrid Larson, the linguist, had managed to translate several key passages, each one more unsettling than the last. "The runestone speaks of a gathering," Ingrid said, her voice trembling as she read from her notes. "A gathering of the gods. They are awakening, and when they do, the world will burn." Eric Johansson, the historian, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "But why now? What's changed?" "The runestone mentions a catalyst," Ingrid replied. "Something that has triggered the gods' return. But it doesn't say what." Freya Olsen, the survivalist, crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "Gods or no gods, we need to focus on survival. If the world's going to hell, we need to be ready." Elin nodded, her mind racing. The runestone had given them a starting point, but the path ahead was still shrouded in mystery. They needed more information, more artifacts, more clues. And they needed them fast. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While reviewing satellite images of Iceland, Magnus noticed something strange, a pattern in the landscape that matched one of the runes on the stone. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a series of ridges and valleys that formed the shape of a wolf. "Fenrir," Elin whispered, her heart pounding. Fenrir, the great wolf of Norse mythology, was one of the key players in Ragnarok. According to the myths, he would break free from his chains and devour the sun, plunging the world into darkness. If the runestone is right, Fenrir's prison is somewhere in Iceland, Magnus said, his voice tinged with excitement. We need to find it. The team wasted no time. Within hours, they were on a plane to Iceland, their gear packed and their nerves on edge. The flight was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. What would they find? And more importantly, what would they unleash? The site was located in a remote valley, its entrance hidden by a wall of rock. The team had to hike for miles to reach it, their progress slowed by the rugged terrain and the ever-present threat of storms. When they finally arrived, they found themselves standing before a massive stone door, its surface covered in carvings that matched the runestone. "This is it," Elin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fenrir's prison." The door was sealed shut, its surface smooth and unyielding. But as Elin approached, she noticed something strange. A small indentation in the center, shaped like a key. "We need the key," she said, turning to the others. "But where?" Her words were cut off by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The ground beneath their feet shook, and the air grew cold, as if the very life were being sucked out of it. "We need to get out of here," Freya said, her voice sharp with urgency. But it was too late. The door began to open, its massive stone slabs grinding against each other with a sound that sent shivers down their spines. And from within the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at them. The team barely made it out alive. Fenrir's prison was not empty, as they had hoped. The great wolf was still chained, but his presence was enough to send them fleeing in terror. They returned to the facility shaken but determined, their resolve stronger than ever. But their troubles were far from over. As they worked to decipher the next set of runes, they began to notice strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctioning, shadows moving on their own, and a growing sense of being watched. "It's the cult," Elin said one night, her voice low. "They're here." The cult of Loki had been a constant threat, their presence felt but never seen. They were fanatics, worshippers of the trickster god who believed that Ragnarok was the only way to cleanse the world of its corruption. "We need to be careful," Magnus warned. "If they find out what we're doing, they'll stop at nothing to destroy us." But the cult was already one step ahead. One evening, as the team gathered in the facility's main hall, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. When they came back on, the runestone was gone. In its place was a single rune carved into the table where the stone had been, the symbol of Loki. The loss of the runestone was a devastating blow, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. "They're leading us to the Bifrost," Elin realized, her voice filled with a mix of fear and determination. "They want us to find it." The Bifrost, the mythical bridge between worlds, was the key to stopping Ragnarok. But it was also a trap, a way for the cult to lure them into the open. "We don't have a choice," Magnus said, his voice grim. "We have to go." The team prepared for the journey ahead, their nerves frayed but their resolve unshaken. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. As they set out, Elin couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But there was no turning back. The world was counting on them. The storm was gathering, and the gods were awakening. Elin and her team were racing against time to uncover the truth and stop Ragnarok. But as they drew closer to the Bifrost, one question loomed larger than ever. What would they have to sacrifice to save the world? The air was thick with tension as Elin and her team prepared for the journey to the Bifrost. The cult of Loki had made their move, stealing the runestone and leaving behind their mark. A taunt, a challenge, and a warning all at once. The symbol of Loki carved into the table was a clear message. They were being watched, and the cult was always one step ahead. "We can't trust anyone," Magnus said, his voice low as he paced the room. "If they infiltrated the facility, they could be anywhere." Elin nodded, her mind racing. The cult's interference had thrown their plans into chaos, but it had also given them a new lead. The Bifrost was real, and the cult wanted them to find it. But why? What did they stand to gain by leading them to the bridge between worlds? "We need to move fast," Elin said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "If the cult wants us to find the Bifrost, we'll find it. But we'll do it on our terms." The team gathered their gear and set out under the cover of darkness, their destination a remote region of Iceland where the Bifrost was said to lie. The journey was treacherous, the landscape ravaged by the storms and volcanic activity that had become the new normal. The roads were cracked and unstable, the air thick with ash, and the sky a swirling mass of dark clouds. As they traveled, Elin couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of her vision, and the wind carried whispers that sent chills down her spine. But every time she turned to look, there was nothing there. The Bifrost site was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was hidden in a valley surrounded by towering cliffs, its entrance marked by a massive stone archway covered in ancient carvings. The ground was littered with fragments of broken statues, gods and monsters frozen in time, their faces twisted in agony or rage. At the center of the valley stood the ruins of the Bifrost, a crumbling bridge that seemed to stretch into the heavens. "This is it," Elin whispered, her voice filled with awe. The bridge between worlds, but the Bifrost was not as they had imagined. The bridge was broken, its once majestic structure reduced to rubble. The air around it crackled with energy, and the ground beneath their feet hummed with a low, resonant vibration. "It's dormant," Magnus said, his voice tinged with disappointment. "We're too late." "Not necessarily," Ingrid replied, her eyes scanning the carvings on the archway. The rune stone mentioned a key. "If we can find it, we might be able to activate the bridge." The team spread out, searching the ruins for any sign of the key. But as they worked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and the whispers on the wind grew louder, more insistent. "We're not alone," Freya said, her hand tightening around the hilt of her knife. Before anyone could respond, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers. He wore a cloak made of raven feathers, and in his hand he held a staff carved with the symbol of Loki. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "We've been expecting you." The man introduced himself as Raffin, the leader of the cult of Loki. He was flanked by a dozen followers, their faces hidden behind masks carved to resemble the trickster god. "You've done well to make it this far," Raffin said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But you're wasting your time. The Bifrost cannot be activated without the key, and the key is ours." Elin's heart sank. The cult had beaten them to it. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "Do you really want to see the world destroyed?" Raffin smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Destruction is necessary for rebirth. The world is corrupt, rotten to its core. Ragnarok will cleanse it, and from the ashes a new world will rise." "You're insane," Magnus spat, stepping forward. "You're willing to sacrifice billions of lives for your twisted vision of the future." Raffin's smile widened. "Sacrifice is the price of salvation. And you, Magnus, should understand that better than anyone." Before Magnus could respond, Raffin raised his staff, and the ground beneath them began to shake. The air grew thick with smoke, and from the shadows emerged creatures straight out of myth. Giant wolves with eyes like fire, serpents with scales that shimmered like oil, and shadows that moved with a life of their own. "Run," Elin shouted, but it was too late. The creatures were upon them, their snarls and hisses filling the air. The team fought back with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Freya wielded her knife with deadly precision, taking down one of the wolves with a well-placed strike. Eric and Ingrid used their knowledge of the ruins to create barriers, buying them precious seconds. But it wasn't enough. As the battle raged, Elin noticed something, the key. It was hanging from Raffin's belt, a small, ornate object that pulsed with a faint, golden light. "Magnus," she shouted, pointing to the key. "We need that?" Magnus nodded, his eyes narrowing with determination. He charged at Raffin, dodging the cult leader's attacks with surprising agility. But just as he reached for the key, Raffin struck him with the staff, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Fool," Raffin sneered. "Did you really think you could stop us?" Elin's heart raced as she watched Magnus struggle to his feet. They were running out of time. If they didn't get the key, the Bifrost would remain dormant, and Ragnarok would be unstoppable. But then something unexpected happened. Freya stepped forward, her expression grim. "I'll hold them off," she said, her voice steady. "Get the key." "Freya, no," Elin cried, but it was too late. Freya charged at Raffin, her knife flashing in the dim light. The cult leader laughed, raising his staff to strike her down. But Freya was faster. She dodged his attack and plunged her knife into his side. causing him to stagger back in pain. "Now," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Elin didn't hesitate. She rushed forward and grabbed the key from Hrafn's belt, her hands trembling as she held it. But as she turned to run, she saw Freya fall, her body crumpling to the ground as the creatures closed in around her. "Freya!" Magnus shouted, his voice filled with anguish. But there was no time to mourn. The ground was shaking violently now, and the air was filled with the sound of cracking stone. The Bifrost was awakening, its energy surging through the ruins like a living thing. "We have to go," Elin shouted, pulling Magnus toward the bridge. The team ran, their hearts pounding as the world around them seemed to collapse. The creatures howled in rage, but they were no match for the power of the Bifrost. As they reached the bridge, Elin inserted the key into a slot at its base. The Bifrost roared to life, its energy surging through the ruins like a living thing. The bridge began to reform, its broken pieces coming together to create a shimmering pathway that stretched into the heavens. But the cost was high. Freya was gone, her sacrifice the price of their success. The team stood at the edge of the Bifrost, their hearts heavy with grief and their minds filled with questions. The bridge was open, but where would it take them? And what would they find on the other side? "We have to go," Elin said, her voice filled with determination. "For Freya, for everyone?" Magnus nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. "Let's finish this." Together they stepped onto the Bifrost, the energy of the bridge surging around them like a living thing. The world around them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and sound. As they crossed the bridge, one question lingered in their minds: what awaited them in Asgard? Asgard was nothing like Elin had imagined. The realm of the gods was a place of impossible beauty and unimaginable power. The sky shimmered with colors that didn't exist in the mortal world, and the air was filled with the sound of distant music, haunting and ethereal. The Bifrost had brought them to the edge of a vast golden hall, its towering spires reaching into the heavens. But there was no time to marvel at the sight. The moment they stepped off the bridge, they were surrounded. Figures clad in gleaming armor emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn and their eyes filled with suspicion. At their head stood a man with a long gray beard, and a single eye that burned with an intensity that made Elin's breath catch in her throat. "Odin!" The Allfather regarded them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You are not welcome here, mortals," he said, his voice echoing with the weight of centuries. "The Bifrost is not a path for the likes of you." Elin stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "We're not here as intruders. We're here to stop Ragnarok." Odin's eye narrowed, and for a moment the air grew heavy with tension. Then, to Elin's surprise, he laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. "Stop Ragnarok," he said, his tone mocking. "You think you can stop what has been foretold since the dawn of time? We have to try," Magnus said, stepping forward. "If Ragnarok happens, the world will be destroyed. Billions of lives will be lost." Odin's expression darkened, and the laughter died on his lips. "You speak of lives as if they matter in the grand scheme of things. Ragnarok is not an end, it is a cycle. A cleansing. From the ashes of the old world, a new one will rise." Elin shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "That's not good enough. We've seen what your cleansing looks like. The storms, the eruptions, the creatures, it's chaos. It's destruction. And it's not just the world that's at stake. It's everything we've built, everything we've fought for." Odin studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the ages. "You mortals are so fragile, so fleeting. And yet you cling to your lives with such fervor. Very well. I will give you a choice." He gestured, and the air around them shimmered, revealing two paths. One led to a vast, empty void, a world wiped clean, waiting to be reborn. The other led back to the mortal realm, but it was shrouded in darkness, its future uncertain. "You can allow Ragnarok to proceed," Odin said, his voice grave. "The world will end, but from its ashes a new one will rise. Or you can return to your world and fight to break the cycle. But know this, if you choose the latter, the gods will not disappear. We will remain watching, waiting. And the world will never be the same." Elin and Magnus exchanged a glance, their minds racing. The choice was clear, but the cost was unimaginable. "We choose to fight," Elin said, her voice firm. "We choose to break the cycle." Odin nodded, a flicker of respect in his eye. So be it. The journey back to the mortal world was a blur. The Bifrost carried them across the void, its energy surging around them like a living thing. But as they approached the mortal realm, the bridge began to collapse, its structure crumbling under the strain. "We're not going to make it," Magnus shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the collapsing bridge. Elin's heart raced as she realized what had to be done. The Bifrost needed a sacrifice to hold it open, a life to anchor it in place. "Go," she shouted, shoving Magnus toward the edge of the bridge. "I'll hold it." "No," Magnus protested, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm not leaving you." But Elin was already moving, her hands gripping the key that had activated the bridge. She could feel its energy coursing through her, binding her to the Bifrost. "You have to go," she said, her voice filled with determination. "The world needs you." "I'll hold the bridge." Magnus hesitated, his eyes filled with anguish. But there was no time to argue. The bridge was collapsing around them, its energy fading fast. With a final, desperate look, Magnus turned and ran, his footsteps echoing on the crumbling bridge. Elin watched him go, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. She had made her choice. As the bridge collapsed around her, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had done what she had to do. She had broken the cycle. Magnus emerged from the Bifrost just as it collapsed behind him, its energy dissipating into the void. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the weight of what had happened settled over him. Elin was gone, but the world was still here. The storms had stopped, the skies clearing for the first time in weeks. The air was still, the earth quiet. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Magnus stood, his legs trembling beneath him. He had a job to do. The world had changed. The gods had not disappeared, as Odin had warned. Their presence was felt in every corner of the world, a constant reminder of what had been lost, and what had been gained. Elin's sacrifice had not been in vain. The world had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild, to grow, to learn from the mistakes of the past. Magnus threw himself into the work, using his wealth and influence to prepare humanity for the challenges ahead. He knew the gods were watching, waiting to see if humanity would prove itself worthy of survival. And in the sky, faint but unmistakable, was a faint glow, a reminder that the gods were still there, watching, waiting.